speaker is Neera Badhwar. She's a professor emerita of philosophy at the University of Oklahoma, where she taught from 1987 to 2010. She's affiliated with the Department of Economics and the Department of Philosophy at George Mason University. Her articles on moral psychology, ethical theory, and political philosophy have appeared in Ethics, Journal of Philosophy, News, and other journals. And for those unfamiliar with the ins and outs of philosophy, those are some of the top philosophy journals to be published in. It's quite distinguished. She's co-authored with Roderick Long the article on Ayn Rand for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. She also, Rod also contributed to the monograph, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's an Objective Studies monograph, Is Virtue Only a Means to Happiness? And Neera is the lead author in that, and Rod Long and David Kelly and Lester Hunt. I think that's it.
Actually, Roderick has his own monograph.
Okay.
So it was J. Friedenberg, I think.
Oh, okay. Yes, you're right. Anyway, so get both of them. So those are both for,
they're available
they're
downstairs.
available in the bookstore downstairs. She has a new book coming out, Well-Being, Happiness in a Worthwhile Life, published by Oxford University Press, which
It's
is coming
already out.
It's out. Okay.
Is it downstairs?
I didn't even think of bringing it. I'm too modest.
How's that? Is that what you need?
Wow. Yeah.
All right. She's been a visiting scholar at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University in 1996 and 97, Social Philosophy and Policy Center, spring 1994, spring 2008, and Liberty Fund in 2002. And I'm happy to say we are ready to go, so I'll turn it over to Neera.
Thank you very much. So my topic is the relationship between kidney markets and communities. Is my voice too loud? Okay, because in my ears it's very loud. A group of people forms a community when and to the extent that it's animated by mutual goodwill and trust. A community may include all the residents of a country or only those who have a common interest or values. So I'll call the latter special interest communities. I'll focus on community and kidney markets in India and the US, and on a special interest community that I call the International Transplant Community, or ITC. By free market, I mean a system of voluntary exchange for mutual benefit, whether legal or illegal, between individuals or groups. It's now widely recognized by philosophers and economists that free markets can create a spirit of community where there was none before. It's less widely recognized that a lack of community spirit can also prevent free and non-exploitative, that is to say just, markets from arising or flourishing. As, of course, can communities that are hostile to markets, for example, the International Transplant Community. This community consists of medical personnel that are involved in the kidney business, so to speak, organizations that procure organs, and international organizations like the International Transplantation Society and WHO and so on. So the exploitative, even involuntary nature of black kidney markets in India is, I claim, best explained both by the lack of community spirit between the different strata of society and the power of the ITC to prevail on the government to ban kidney markets. The absence of legal markets in kidneys has also created a situation in which tens of thousands of people all over the world needlessly suffer and die. The number of kidney patients on the waiting list in the US now is around 100,000. And then there are other thousands and thousands of people who are not on the list because it's too late for them to get a kidney transplant. They are too sick to get a transplant. So my aim here is fourfold. One, to examine the ITC's claim that kidney markets will undermine community here and elsewhere. To argue that flourishing non-exploitative kidney markets require a sense of community. To argue that in developing countries, the best hope for such a society is global free markets, and to explain the ITC's vociferous opposition to kidney markets, or at least to propose a hypothesis. Okay, so the first aim. According to the ITC, markets are undesirable because they will crowd out the altruistic motive that undergirds communities. Some even oppose paying funeral expenses for cadaveric donors, lest the purity of the donor's altruism be tainted by the dark shadow of self-interest. And this is the attitude that prevails in not only the kidney transplantation community, but all organ communities. Michael Boo, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of the National Marrow Donor Program, refuses to list bone marrow donors on his website because he says, is that what we want people to be motivated by? He himself, of course, did get marrow from someone, so he's safe. But this statement of his was made and this action of not listing people, the names of people who want to sell marrow came as a response to a recent decision by the Supreme Court allowing people to sell their bone marrow so long as it was taken by a certain procedure. So they legalized bone marrow sales if the marrow was taken by a certain procedure. Okay, so there is this desire to have all of these organs made available only from a purely altruistic motive. The quest for such Kantian purity, however, is doomed. Human beings typically have multiple motives for their actions, a fact that led Kant himself to state that we could never be sure that our actions come from a pure heart. Thus, the donations are often motivated by shame or guilt in the face of family pressure, donations, right, not sales, donations, rather than only by concern for the prospective recipient of the kidney. And nearly all of these donations are made within the family. So there are far too few of such donations to meet the need. In light of these facts, the claim by two nephrologists, Danovich and Leichman, that kidney selling would distort and undermine the altruism and common citizenship on which our whole organ donation system currently relies, because the moral commitment to do one's duty can be weakened by financial compensation and monetary reward, is mere wishful thinking. The claim that the current system expresses a sense of common citizenship is further undermined by the fact that we now have a commons in cadaveric kidneys, to which everyone has an equal right, but no one has any obligation to keep stocked. This tragedy of the commons is the very opposite of the ideal of common citizenship or community. For those of you who are not familiar with the idea of the tragedy of the commons, the author of that idea is, or at least of that term, is Garrett Hardin, who said when no one owns a property, or when everyone owns it, then it is very soon depleted because each person tries to get the most for himself or herself, and no one has any obligation to keep it stocked, right? So common examples are fisheries, grazing grounds, and so on. The most important objection to the crowding out of the altruistic motive worry, in my view, is a moral one. If altruism is a concern for others for their own sake, then the insistence on altruistic-only kidneys is its very opposite, because it forcibly prevents patients and prospective vendors from saving their own lives or lifting themselves out of poverty, respectively, through mutually beneficial exchanges. And both justice and compassion dictate that the important thing is to have enough kidneys, voluntarily and non-exploitatively donated or sold, whatever the motive of the giver. Now, there are things that we ought to do for others without compensation: everyday acts of kindness and generosity, low-risk rescues in emergencies, and so on. And in a society with a spirit of community, most people do such things. Maybe we ought also to become organ donors after death, if the fear that our lives might be prematurely terminated on the operating table can be allayed. That is one of the fears that people have. That if I say, okay, you can have my organs after death, well, in some situations, the doctors might think it's better to let me die than to save me, right? But becoming a live donor for a perfect stranger is far from something we are morally required to do. I'm not blaming this man for seeking a live donor for his wife, or maybe he's looking for any kind of donor. But I'm saying no one has an obligation to satisfy his wish. On a promiscuous theory of our duties to others, it can easily be argued, as one writer already has argued, that, quote, the sick have a right under some circumstances to the body parts of the healthy, and that the state has the moral power to enforce that right. I hate to admit it, but she's a philosopher. I think other academics are just as bad, though, anyone who discusses political or ethical issues. A society in which most people did believe that they had such a duty would be neither very happy nor very moral. Because in such a society, most people would also believe that they had a claim on others' kidneys. What? You are holding 2 kidneys when I have none? No functioning one? And a society in which people felt entitled to each other's body parts would be a society in which they regarded each other and themselves as mere means to each other's ends, the very antithesis of a community. So poor Colbert, he has not demanded a kidney for himself, but I couldn't resist the temptation to use this picture. It just fit in so well. The insistence on altruistic-only donations, legally enforced, amounts to a death sentence for tens of thousands of people every year. Instead of treating people as ends in themselves by respecting their freedom to benefit themselves, the ITC has elevated altruistic donation to the status of an end in itself, an end to which human beings may be freely sacrificed. An unintended effect of the near global ban on markets is the growth of transplant tourism, whereby people from well-off countries travel to poor countries to buy kidneys from living vendors in the black market. There is one exception to this ban. There is one country that has followed its own wishes, that has not obeyed this global ban. Who do you think that is? Which country do you think that is?
Iran.
Yes. Did you guess that, or you knew it already? What? Did you already know that, or did you guess? You knew it. Yeah. Yeah. So all too often, these exchanges in poor countries are involuntary, or even when they're voluntary, they're exploitative, thanks to a generalized lack of goodwill. In India, the well-off often prey on the not-so-well-off, the not-so-well-off on the poor, and the poor on the very poor. There's a wonderful book by Catherine Boo, who's a journalist at The New Yorker. She's married to an Indian, and she spent a year or 2 in Mumbai. And she spent thousands of hours interviewing people in this slum. And so, she talks about how instead of cooperating and trying to build better lives for themselves, they're at war with each other, with a few exceptions. Most of them are at war with each other. Now, that's not true of all communities of poor people. It's not true of the inhabitants of the slum Dharavi, which was featured in this movie, Slumdog Millionaire. How many of you have seen it? Yeah, okay. So they've had their bad times, but at least when the movie was made and soon after that, they were doing well. Okay, sometimes the very poor also prey on each other. The vast socioeconomic differences between the various strata of society serve as a barrier both to the development of a sense of community and to a strong rule of law. And the absence of these serves as a further barrier to a genuinely free, non-exploitative market in kidneys. Poor people are promised huge sums of money that dwindle to a fraction of the original sum after the surgery or fail to materialize at all. They often undergo badly performed nephrectomies with little or no post-operative medical care forthcoming. This, in turn, often leads to an inability to work, leaving them worse off financially as well. In short, the poor are treated as a collection of spare parts, mere means to the ends of others. So even when kidney markets in India are not involuntary, they are often exploitative of kidney vendors in taking unfair advantage of their desperation. And this happens not only in India, but in other poor countries as well. Now, some economists would reject my claim that a voluntary, mutually beneficial transaction can be exploitative. They would maintain that all that's needed for a just exchange is that it be voluntary and give both parties what they expect ex ante to get from it, what they expect to get from it at the time of the deal. And all that's needed for a voluntary exchange is that it be free of force and fraud. But the claim that all exchanges free of force and fraud are equally voluntary and equally just can't survive philosophical analysis, or for that matter, the common sense of the matter. Consider, for example, a desperately poor but healthy woman whose family is on the brink of starvation because of a drought. She agrees to sell her kidney in exchange for $100 or a large sack of rice from a well-off man, a payment that was actually deemed sufficient by a nephrologist in Manila. Just consider that. This is a doctor, and she claims that $100 or even just a large sack of rice for a poor vendor is payment enough, right? I mean, think of the inhumanity in that attitude. But this woman's choice, the vendor, her choice is made under duress. It's not coerced, but it has a feature in common with coerced choices. It is done unwillingly in response to unusually constrained external circumstances and an offer far below the usual market price. So I would say that her action is neither involuntary nor fully voluntary, but mixed, done only to avoid something even worse. Aristotle has a very insightful discussion of voluntary, involuntary, and mixed actions in Book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics. I think these days people tend to classify actions as either voluntary or involuntary and nothing in between. I think there is an in between. Likewise, when her well-off buyer drives a hard bargain, he doesn't coerce her, but his action has a feature in common with coercion. It exploits her vulnerability to gain a highly disproportionate advantage for himself. Like coercion and fraud, an exploitative exchange shows scant regard for the vulnerable person. Now, this last might invite the objection that since the kidney for a sack of rice deal will enable the kidney seller and her family to survive for a month instead of, say, only 5 days, it can hardly be described as exploitative. So the objector might say that exploitation requires a harmful use of someone for one's own advantage. But I say in reply, the harsh terms of the exchange are harmful to the kidney vendor in the long run. For a nephrectomy on a woman about to go on a starvation diet is all but guaranteed to kill her. The kidney recipient saves the desperate woman's life at time T1 at the cost of depriving her of her health and perhaps even life at time T2. Compared to the baseline of no exchange and certain death from starvation in 5 days, she is better off. This is reason enough not to ban kidney sales. As the philosopher Alan Wertheimer argues, however, the no exchange baseline is not the only relevant baseline in evaluating an exchange. Evaluating the justice of an exchange requires comparing it to the baseline of a just exchange. And by this baseline, the woman is worse off. The woman's situation is akin to that of a man dying of thirst in a desert, and the buyer's to that of a well-stocked, well-off tourist who agrees to give the dying man water in return for all his property after they reach home. Every philosophical theory of ethics joins common sense morality in condemning such a deal as unconscionable, and the common law agrees by refusing to uphold it if the thirsty man reneges on it. For an almost costless rescue such as this ought to be done without demanding anything in return, even though, as most of us believe, it ought not to be legally compulsory. Any well-off tourist with water to spare ought to give the thirsty man some water just because the thirsty man is a human being like himself who has been rendered helpless by circumstance. Likewise, any well-off buyer of a kidney ought to give the desperate woman the price she would have commanded had she not been desperate, and not to do so just because the kidney seller is a human being like himself rendered helpless by circumstance. In both the desert and the kidney exchanges, the well-off parties save the desperate individuals from imminent death in exchange for a long-term advantage to themselves and long-term grievous harm, perhaps even death, for the desperate individuals. In so doing, they treat the desperate individuals like resources to be sucked dry and left to their fate. Their actions and attitudes say, in effect, that the life and well-being of these individuals are of no moment after they have served their interests. So they both degrade the vulnerable individuals and harm them. Like force and fraud, benefiting ourselves by imposing a grave cost on vulnerable others treats people as mere means to our ends instead of as ends in themselves. And to do so is unjust because it doesn't give people their due. The snapshot view of exchanges, typical of economics, obscures these facts because it omits the details that make them visible. For those of you who are still not convinced by my argument, think of what Dagny would do in these circumstances, similar circumstances. Would she take advantage of a poor woman to make the best deal for herself, the best deal in terms of money? Does she ever do this when she has a choice between money and treating people well? When the government passes Directive 10-289, freezing wages, profits, and inventions, Dagny quits in protest, declaring, "I will not work as a slave or as a slave driver." She will not use people as tools for her advantage. Ironically, it's the attempt to save people from exploitation or coercion by banning kidney markets that has led to the unimaginably high levels of exploitation and injustice that we see in underground kidney deals. A global free trade in kidneys would lead Western insurance companies and transplant centers to establish branches in poor countries that brought higher standards of screening with more sophisticated facilities, better drugs, and so on. And then prices would rise in poor countries and fall in wealthy countries. Okay, so to go back to Dagny, right? Okay, so if we had a global free trade in kidneys, then prices would level out. And immigrants to the US and other Western countries who have a smaller potential supply of kidneys from their own ethnic group in their chosen countries could go to their countries of origin in order to get better matched kidneys. So then the question arises, why does the ITC as a body still oppose kidney markets in spite of the thousands of deaths every year and the weakness of its arguments against markets? Some people say that the medical personnel who oppose markets are motivated by greed. A shortage of kidneys results in a higher price for their services. I don't find that terribly convincing, but whatever the merit of the speculation, we mustn't overlook psychological reasons for the opposition to kidney markets. One common reason for agreement among members of a community is fear of their peers' or leaders' disapproval. This is the dark side of communities and communalism. Fear of disapproval or even ostracism by peers or people of authority, leading to conformity to the former and obedience to the latter, is a potent factor in human behavior, observable in the playground as much as in private and public organizations. It's also been demonstrated in many experiments, including most famously the Solomon Asch and Stanley Milgram experiments. Those who are not familiar with them can ask me afterwards. Another everyday observable phenomenon that has received support in the Milgram experiments is what some psychologists have called moral entrapment. As the name suggests, moral entrapment occurs when, by small innocuous steps, we find ourselves committed to doing something wrong and find the costs of rejecting it now too high to bear. For example, a lot of actions by many Nazis can be explained by moral entrapment. So they keep cooperating with the regime, and finally they realize what they are doing, but they cannot back off now, because to back off now would mean having to reject all their rationalizations, their self-deceptions along the way, and would mean that they had to take responsibility for what they had done till that point. So this might explain why even those who are in a position of authority in the ITC have not come out in favor of markets, right? For them, the problem is not obedience to authority, because they are the authority. If they were to admit now that they are wrong to oppose kidney markets, they would have to admit that they had been wrong all along. And so they would have to admit their share of the responsibility for the unnecessary suffering and thousands of deaths over the years. And that is far too hard to admit. So the best hope for a change in this policy is that new people will replace the ones who are currently in leadership positions, and that medical technology will soon come up with an artificial kidney. Okay, thank you. If you're interested in looking up some of the people I have cited, Wertheimer and Zwolinski, they have an article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You can just Google Stanford Encyclopedia and you'll get it. Locke makes the same kind of argument in the case of a ship that comes across another ship in distress that has lost all its anchors. So the ship that's doing well can demand any price it likes, but ought it to? Would it be justified or even excused in doing that? And then you can look up Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics for mixed action. Okay, thank you.